Hello, beautiful people. I'm Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and tonight I'm going to respond to a request I've received on a couple of different occasions from my viewers. They've asked about my books, my library, such as it is, what sort of books I have, what sort of subjects I like to read on, and perhaps in doing so I can also sort of tap some of the titles that I think are interesting and maybe mention briefly why. Mainly, I want to roll through this quickly so that you can see the kind of books that are most important to me. I bring all this up in part because I think it illustrates something very, very interesting, which is the technique of going into a person's house when you're dealing with a reader. Reminds me of that old Bill Hicks line.
Get this! Another true story. This is going to frighten you because it's absolutely true. I'm down in that town, Fife. After the show, I go to a Waffle House. I'm not proud of it. I'm hungry. I'm eating, I'm alone, and I'm reading a book. Waitress walks over to me. Hey, what you reading for? Is that like the weirdest question ever? I have never, ever been asked that. You know what I mean? What are you reading? Oh, okay. But what are you reading for? Shit, you stumped me. Why do I read? Why do I read? I don't know. Guess I read for a lot of reasons, you know. And one of them is so I don't end up being a fucking waffle waitress, all right? Then this trucker in the next booth gets up, stands over me and goes, well, looks like we got ourselves a reader. What the fuck's going on here?
Well, if you get into the house of a reader, you have the opportunity to take a look at their books. And it's important to understand that these books are the record of a journey, an intellectual journey, a conceptual journey, whatever it may be. But the books themselves, which books have been chosen, which subjects of interest they reflect, the way in which they've been ordered, all of these things reveal quite a bit about the mind, interests, and background of the person who has those books on the shelves. So for a lot of people, you know, it's something that nobody really notices. You know, I've been over to people's houses and you'll see that they have one bookshelf and it's got a bunch of crap on it, like, you know, knickknacks and gewgaws and sports trophies or things that are supposed to be decorative. And then there'll be like 4 to 6 books over on one side of the shelf that, you know, have kind of clung to life since their college days. That's not really a reader. And what I'm talking to you about tonight won't apply to them. It'll apply to people who have larger collections, people who have enough books that you can begin to look at all of them and correlate them and kind of see a whole greater than the sum of its parts. So I'm going to take you through these books over here on my right. This is sort of the core of my library that I've hauled around the world with me a couple of times. And then there's another bookshelf over here with a few on it. And over here in the back, I have my collecting books about arms and armor. All of these, again, sort of reflecting different phases I've been through and different interests I've had. But without further ado, let me jump into this. I'm going to start with the main bookshelves, the ones over here on the side to my right that I mentioned. And I'll move from left to right, from top to bottom, which is kind of the order. And then I'll jump over to some of these other bookshelves so that you can see what I've got, what I've been interested in. And I'll call out some titles along the way. All right, so starting with the top left, what do we have here? Well, the green and red volumes in the very top left, those are Loeb's Classic Library Editions. Many of you will probably know this. If you don't know about the Loeb series, definitely look into it. It provides translations parallel with the original text for Latin editions, Latin works from the classical period in red, and Greek works in green. We've also got some other stuff here with the so-called pre-Socratics. I also commend them to your attention. Everybody sort of thinks that it all begins with Socrates, and then you're missing things like Pythagoras. You're missing things like the early sophists, Antiphon, people like this. You're also missing Heraclitus, for example. You can also see I've got Plato, of course. There's some Aristotle, not much, frankly. I need to get my hands on more and read more, but I favored the Platonists more than the Peripatetics. So you also see the Neoplatonists, as you would expect, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, some other Latin authors up there, Cicero, Seneca. I've also got, for the earlier Greek philosophy, Diogenes, Kunikos, the Cynic. The other one that's important there is the Oxford Classical Dictionary. That's an older edition that you see on the second shelf down, but that book is enormously useful. And honestly, it often ends up by my bed for months, and I just read different articles from it before I go to bed. We've got some Budge stuff there. I'm not really into the Egyptians very much, but you know, I picked up that book. I have a few volumes on the Egyptians material. I don't really get into it until the Egyptian area, until the time of the the Hellenistic period, where you get Gnosticism, Hermeticism. So you see those kind of titles reflected there. Other stuff on Mithraism, which is very, very interesting. The Genius Figure in Antiquity is a fascinating book. It's on the shelf there. You can also see at least two, maybe three of these basic classical dictionaries. The Oxford one is best, but based on some advice I got from Tim years ago, I keep as many of those little classical dictionaries around because they're useful as reference works. Not as useful now with the web, but good to keep around. So we jump down from the top left to the middle left, and this is where you'll see sort of the beginning of the Christian period. I've got some stuff on Kabbalah, the Gershom Scholem stuff. Also, I believe, translation of De Arte Kabbalistica, which is early Renaissance text on Kabbalism. A couple of editions or translations, versions of the Bible there, the Book of Mormon. Some of the older Christian thinking, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, in particular, some stuff with St. Augustine, and then it pretty quickly jumps forward. I don't have a lot of material from the Latin or the Greek church fathers. I've just got kind of a smattering of different kinds of material. Richard of St. Victor stands out, like Hugh of St. Victor, as a practitioner of the medieval art of memory. There's also Ivan Illich's book In the Vineyard of the Text, which is an interesting book if you're into the art of memory. There's also the Etymologies of Isidore of Seville, which is just a great sort of compendium of ancient knowledge as reflected in the lens of this early Christian encyclopedist, I guess you could call him. Then the next shelf down, we've got some more Christian material and start to verge properly into some historical works and some literature, both from the Middle Ages. Actually, there's Macrobius down there, and Martianus Capella, I think, too. So that's late antique, early medieval, the last of the learning and lore of the antique world kind of being carried forward up until the Renaissance saw another flowering of it. The Romance of the Rose, essential reading for background on the troubadours, and esoteric theories, or allegories, I should say, regarding love and its meaning, the different types of it. And fittingly, we can jump through that, from that over through, I guess, Guido Cavalcante and the Dolce Stil Nuovo, over to Dante himself, and there's a bunch of material there from when I was into the Florentine authors, Boccaccio, Dante, and the rest. There's a set of Petrarch's Remedies for Fortune Fair and Foul, which Tim pointed me to as an opportunity. Bought it from Edward R. Hamilton for cheap. There's one there called The Kindness of Strangers, which is great. It's all about the way in which foundlings were treated. It looks into myths of what's called the exposure of children. When you want to have an unwanted child and you may leave it in the forest or leave it on the steps of a church, this kind of thing. It's It's a careful study of that phenomenon in Western history, and a fascinating one. And then, you can see Petrarch. Again, I was into the Florentines for a bit there. And you can see multiple translations of Dante's Commedia. I find that it's best to read several translations in order to get some sense of what was actually said. Okay, and on the bottom left, we've got some more of the same kind of a European medley ranging from the Renaissance up through that. Actually, there's a lot of stuff mixed in there that's probably closer to medieval, like the Ship of Fools. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. That might be 15th century. What do I know? You can see some stuff on Lorenzo the Magnificent, some of the classic sort of Warburg, Courtauld Institute material. You've got Panofsky. What else do we have here? Collections of translations of humanist writers from the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance. There's also, more collections, a mix of all kinds of texts like Piers Plowman or The Cloud of Unknowing. Can't remember exactly what is in that horizontal stack. And I can't fully see it on the image. More stuff on the Florentines, Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, book on Durer. And then the next shelf down is much more English, and it gets a little bit closer to the modern period. You can see the Yale Shakespeare there, Chaucer, a good bit on the Elizabethan period, which I find fascinating, particularly Donne. Also what are called the metaphysical poets. And then I had a bit of a thing with Blake there for a bit, so you can see some of his works mixed in. And now we have the top of the center shelf. The center shelf for me is kind of like my core stuff, my esoteric strangeness that has interested me most over the years. So with the left shelf, you have sort of what I've organized as a path upwards sort of through Western history and culture. And then the center shelf here has a mix of some other things, but it kind of picks up with the from the Florentine period forward, because I kind of move laterally out of this whole stream of history over into a focus on esoterica. And I came to that focus on esoterica through sort of two paths. One is sort of what you'd call pop ritual magic, the Golden Dawn, Israel Regardie, Aleister Crowley, all that kind of stuff. And we'll see that in a moment. But these are shelved higher up because, frankly, they're more important to me than that other stuff. So you can see some of the old grimoires, the books of occult philosophy, like you can see Agrippa's 3 books, the 4th book that is attributed to him, Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon. Then, some of Edwin Arthwaite's stuff. What's his name? Arthur Edward Waite. The book of Black Magic and Pacts, which is reproductions, reprints. Great book on Trithemius. Some of the stuff from Marsilio Ficino, which, ties into my interest in Florentine Neoplatonism from the Italian Renaissance. A great book on Pico della Mirandola's syncretism, some of Pico's works. Then there's Magic and Experimental Science by Lynn Thorndike. I think I'm missing a volume or 2. I'm gonna have to get on Bookfinder about that. Then next shelf down, you've got the Picatrix, for those of you who are familiar with it. That's from Ouroboros Press. William Kiesel, who I've corresponded with, was kind enough to send me those. Also, again, like the Panofsky stuff, you've got Jean Sesnick, Survival of the Pagan Gods, Spiritual and Demonic Magic from Ficino to Campanella, John Dee, book by French on Dee. Of course, lots of Frances Yates. I am a big Frances Yates fan. She was an absolutely remarkable scholar, and her Art of Memory is required reading for everyone, as far as I'm concerned. Then you've got all kinds of stuff. Mary Carruthers, she has also done just really excellent work on the Art of Memory in the Middle Ages, filling in the gaps that were left with Frances Yates's pioneering stuff. Then there's Nicholas of Cusa, who is definitely worth your time if you want to dig into some interesting byways of medieval thinking. It's really, I mean, he's part of the Renaissance, but there's quite a bit from the medieval period that he carries forward, and yet then somehow brings it all together in a way that can make contemporary philosophers and even contemporary mathematicians and physicists scratch their heads. This material is put in there right next to Giordano Bruno, and I've tried to get my hands on just about everything I can regarding Bruno. Nicholas of Cusa was a big influence upon him, as were Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino from the shelf above. But that's more for people who are into Renaissance Hermeticism. And here we have the middle of the middle shelf. This has on the lower of these shelves some of the books I mentioned from back in middle school and high school that I started with, you know, the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, witchcraft stuff. The upper part of this shelf, though, has some more sophisticated material. Buildings and Power by Thomas A. Marcus. I cannot recommend it highly enough. A fascinating book that looks at how relationships are constrained in space, thereby affecting society simply through the exercise of choices about architecture that control how human beings can interact. I believe there's some Swedenborg up there, some stuff on angel magic, alchemy, a lot of the Fanes Press titles. I corresponded on friendly terms for some time with David Feidler. So you see several Fanes Press volumes. There's several of the volumes of Alexandria, which is a collection of essays that he published at intervals. Volume 3 includes an article that I wrote on the Tarocchi of Mantegna. And because no version of that deck was commercially available, I created one of my own that you can see here. What's interesting about it is that it is unlike any other tarot deck. It's a series of copperplate engravings from the middle of the 15th century, and it does not have anything like the same structure that you see with most tarot decks. You can see that there are several books on the tarot, including Crowley's Book of Thoth, a rather interesting little volume there called Alchemy and Middle Earth, or Alchemy in Middle Earth. It's by a guy who also did part of the foreword, I believe, for the Royal Book of Spiritual Chivalry, Mahmoud Shelton. And there are several other interesting books on the upper of these shelves. Jocelyn Godwin's book on music, mysticism, and magic. One edition of The Dream of Polyphilo. And for that matter, you can see it down below on the lower shelf, the full edition of the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili. That's Jocelyn Godwin again, translated that. The Golden Game is a great collection of alchemical plates. There's Opus Magnum, a princely gift from a friend of mine. That one was published in the Czech Republic, and I was lucky enough to get my hands on it. And then a great book on the Labyrinth, basically comparing examples of labyrinths that are attested or evident geographically across the world and historically in any number of periods. Fascinating book. And then you've got the classic, the books basically to the right of the Golden Game, you know, the bigger books, The Dream of Polyphilo. Everything over to the right is from high school, and, you know, some of it from middle school, you know, the stuff on witchcraft and astral projection, an old paperback of Crowley's story, Moonchild, you know, the William Gray, Aleister Crowley, Kenneth Grant, tarot cards and stuff. That's really from when I was younger. And on the lower of the middle shelves, you can see that I looked into Islam, in particular Sufism and heterodox Shiite Islam quite a bit. A lot of that went with my time in Istanbul, in particular the works of Henri Corbin. He's absolutely brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He's up there with Francis Yates as an author that I really can't recommend highly enough. And so you can see some of his stuff on Ibn al-Arabi, Suhrawardi, Iranian Zoroastrianism, you know, his spiritual body, celestial earth, tracking some of that stuff up from the Zoroastrian period and into examples in Shiite Iranian theosophy. I've also got some stuff there on the Nizari Ismailis, known popularly as the Assassins, you know, Sinan, Hassan Sabah Alamut, the Old Man of the Mountain, all that stuff. I've got John Colaruso's Nart Sagas of the Caucasus, some books on the Caucasus in general. I think there's Kautilya's Arthashastra down there on the lower shelf, and you know, some of the classics by Evan Wentz on Tibetan yoga, Woodruff's works on Tantra in 2 volumes down there. I'm sure there are many more, but those are a couple of the books he put out on that subject. Yantra is a great book with symbols and patterns for meditation, what are often called mandalas. So you can see there's, you know, a fair amount of Muslim material, most of it very heterodox, and then some on the Caucasus, some from India, but you can see my library doesn't have a really good representation of ancient Indian thought at all. And here we have the top shelves on the right-hand shelf, and you can see a number of books that were recommended to me by Tim years ago. Teilhard de Chardin's The Phenomenon of Man, a number of books by Eliade, also Otto, Mysticism East and West, and then I believe a different Otto, Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy. And from there you jump over to things like Nietzsche. I had a big thing for him for quite some time, still enjoy him very much. A lot of Pomo stuff, Derrida, Foucault, there's Roland Barthes, Deleuze, there's Bergson's Matter and Memory, things like that up there. And then the next shelf down has more to do with my recent research into the meaning of symbols. So I kind of had to read a lot of the material on the lower of these shelves to bring myself up to speed on how people use non-linguistic signs to organize behavior. So you can see some things on cultural strategy and branding. That's Douglas Holt. There's Ryan Holiday's book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, which is entertaining. There's, of course, The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. I believe there's Trotter's Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War. A couple of books by Edward Bernays, of course. Then some very interesting books by a guy I came across, Eviatar Zerubbabel. Very interesting stuff. Time maps, for example, is great. He breaks down the different ways different cultures break up cycles of time. And if I hadn't read his book, I would not be so familiar with the way in which during the French Revolution, they tried to move into a system of what they called decades of 10 days each to make human cycles, social and time cycles, more rational, as they put it. And he also went into how the Soviets, after the Russian Revolution, tried to set up work-related cycles, a week of 5 days. Fascinating stuff. Again, his name, Eviatar Zerubbabel. Then there's goodies, you know, Domestication of the Savage Mind, Claude Lévi-Strauss's The Savage Mind. We've got some Umberto Eco, Ong's Orality and Literacy, and then some books on reading, writing systems, introductory stuff for linguistics. The most important 2 books up there are Mallory and Adams's book on Indo-European words and their meanings and the kind of things that can be puzzled together out of the traces that remain to us. And then there's Watkins's How to Kill a Dragon, which is, I guess, aspects of Indo-European poetics. He traces fundamental elements of poetic compositions, conceptual components, and sort of key phrases that can be seen or traced
and discerned in the corpus of poetry that remains to us from the various far-flung branches of the Indo-European world. Wow, it's late at night, and I managed to sort of explain that. I deserve a biscuit. Then next down, a number of other interesting books, again, as a part of my study regarding symbolism and non-linguistic signs visible in the environment. There's Per Mallerup's book on brands, and there's Denise Schmant-Besserat's book, Before Writing. Very interesting stuff. I don't entirely agree with her thesis, or her picture of how writing emerged. I think she misses the foundations and mistakes what she found for the foundations that she cannot actually see. But still, she sheds light on a whole period, and it's really fascinating and good work. There's Jane Kaplan's, or edited by Jane Kaplan's. It's the Written on the Body, which is all about tattooing. Some good academic articles on that. Writing and Authority in Early China. It's great. The Symbolic Species is also great. And up there horizontally, you can see Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, which is excellent required reading for anybody who likes the Bernays stuff, or Poison, Ivy Lee. You can also see their traditional marking systems. It's got the very distinct cyan lettering on black. That is a book I helped edit, and I also contributed to, and it is the aforementioned, part of the aforementioned attention I gave to non-linguistic signs. A number of other books there. The Science of the Swastika, which is a sort of consideration of Sinnbildforschung, the sign studies that were en vogue in Germany in the period running roughly from the 1890s up through the fall of the Third Reich. Documenting Individual Identity, that is Kaplan, again, I believe. There's By the Grace of Guile, which is a great book, The Sign of Three. A lot of people should know that. That's a collection of essays that sort of relate to semiotics. Umberto Eco, a number of other people. Szebok, I believe, if I'm pronouncing the name right, remembering it right. Thomas Szebok, I think. Anyway, I haven't been looking into my semiotics much recently, but there's more of that you can see up on the shelf, as well as Tufte's, visual explanations, visual display of quantitative information, envisioning information, that kind of stuff. Next down, you've got a whole sort of mix. My interest in typography from my bookbinding days. Also, what I applied when I was doing graphic design, heraldry, flags, and in particular, a number of volumes on color. I haven't read all of them yet, but I've assembled them for a consideration that I will be giving to color. There's also a rather nice Persian silver ashtray there. That's Qajar from the 1920s. Charming little piece. Then the bottom shelves of the right-hand shelf, we can move through this really quickly. There's just some books on language grammar, quite a few Turkish English and English Turkish dictionaries, because I'm working on a translation from Ottoman Turkish. I've also got a number of foreign language dictionaries there, as well as the, the Shorten Lewis Latin Dictionary, letterpress edition, hand-bound in leather. I was lucky enough to get my hands on that back in the day in Berkeley when I lived out there. The Oxford English Dictionary. Everyone should have a copy of the unabridged version, period, and a number of other reference works. So that's it for the big right-hand set of shelves. We'll just look really quickly at the rest of them. I'm afraid I'm probably going to put people to sleep here. All right, so I have another shelf across the room of the same sort, and this is a new set of books that I'm beginning to put together. The ones on the top are really ethology, animal behavior. When I was looking at signs in visible space, I found that I was learning much more from how animals respond to territorial marks than I was from reading what semioticians and linguists had to say about writing and signs and graphemes and writing proper versus syllabaries and all that stuff. I found it much more useful to go and look at how animals deal with marks in space. and indeed make them: territorial marks, resource marks, environmental marks. So this is material that's relatively new for me. I've been reading on ethology and animal behavior only, I don't know, for 7-8 years now, not for a long time. So this is new material coming together, and I'm still trying to organize it. Next shelf down, this is sort of the rump of my psychology library. It was never large, but most of what I have, I think it's Neumann and Jung, and those books are off on loan to Tim and have been for several years now. But it's all right. I have, I don't know, a couple of pallets of his own books held hostage downstairs, so I'm sure they'll be back. And then dropping down, I basically, you saw on the left-hand side of the lower shelves of the main shelves we already went over, I have things like the Elizabethan period, the medieval period, the Italian Renaissance. Well, I just sort of have some material that's coming together that I didn't have room for over on that shelf, and that is French thinkers, writers, Etienne de la Boétie, Montaigne, Rabelais. So this is La Rochefoucauld. It's all sort of coming together over here, and I've got a few other books that were just thrown up on the shelves. I've got an incipient little astrology section down there, you can see on the lower right. And then all those copies you see on the left-hand side of the lower shelf are part of an enormous haul of books I brought back from Berkeley and the Bay Area when I lived there. I worked at Kinko's on the swing shift and graveyard shift, and I had a friend there who had a City College library card, and I basically forged one at the Kinko's and then used it to get a Berkeley library card. And then I went in and checked out a number of books at Berkeley, and I carried them into Kinko's and copied them. And when I came back to Atlanta after a year or two of living there, I had to bring a pallet of copy boxes home because I had copied all these hard-to-find books. This was before the internet, so a lot of my library is in the form of these copies. What can I say? I was willing to get creative to get access to the Berkeley University Library. UCB Library is awesome. And on the bottom shelf here, you can see Chinese, Japanese stuff. The I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, the translation of that I recommend is the one recommended to me by Tim Rudisil years ago, and that is the Macintosh translation. You've got some books down here on Zen. There's also The Art of War, of course. Multiple translations of everything, wherever I can get multiple translations, particularly with the Chinese, given the multivalent meanings of the characters. It's important to get your hands on as many translations as possible to ferret out the meaning. And the same with the Art of War, which I've shown a particular interest in, and hence the same thing, multiple translations. And really quickly, because this is beginning to go on for quite a bit longer than I thought it would, this is part of my arms and armor and collecting shelf from when I was collecting weapons, metalwork, mostly from the Muslim world. So you can see all kinds of books up in here. It's very often necessary for me to get books in other languages because this is it's a field where there's not a lot of high quality scholarship. So you have to kind of go far afield where you can, when you can, to pick up books from other countries. So there are a number of books on particularly the saber that come out of Poland because they're known for being masters of horsemanship and the saber. There's several from Russia, like Astvat Saturian's book on Caucasian weapons, which is brilliant. Another great book over here is the Karlsruher Türkenbeute, which is the collection of Turkish booty taken off the battlefield after the second siege of Vienna. If I remember correctly, that was 1683, and Kara Mustafa got run off, and basically the Ottoman elite in command of the army had to leave their treasure on the field because they had to flee for their lives, and this entire collection was taken to Germany and stored there. You can see some other things here. Robert Cato's book on Moro swords, some stuff on Victorian weapons and equipment of the Victorian soldier, stuff on the U.S. Civil War, the U.S. colonial period. There's Bouton's catalog of arms. There's also the Henri Moser Charlottenfels collection there. I had the Bouton and the Henri Moser Charlottenfels books rebound, just because they're rather valuable and hard to find. Some books on the Circassians. Again, a lot of stuff on the Caucasus, a lot of stuff on arms and armor, weapons from the Muslim world, Central Asia, Russia. And I have a number of other bookshelves throughout the house. This one is mainly art books that are too large and heavy to go on most shelves. These are, on the Etruscan, Scythian stuff, the Arthur Sackler collection of, ancient bronze artifacts. There's Orange Perski, which is, I believe, a Polish, Polish book on Persian arms. The Fiegel collection, his Damascus steel stuff. Lots of stuff on Thracian gold, Mughal, arms and armor, Oriental rugs, and a number of art books, in particular Balthus, whom I quite like. There's also some stuff on Tibetan art, art from other cultures and countries. And banished to a hallway because I don't have much space, I actually keep a little bit of fiction. Not much. There's quite a bit of poetry here. Charles Simic, who's a Serbian poet who lives here in the US. I like his stuff very much. There's also, some William S. Burroughs, beat poets, Naked Lunch, Ginsberg's Howl, Bukowski, all of that kind of obligatory stuff. Borges, who I like quite a bit. Also Villon for, rakish medieval poems. There's Italo Calvino stuff, some Umberto Eco, Hermann Hesse, Sade, a lot of people, Ivo Andrić, even some Nick Cave, Leonard Cohen. The only other really interesting stuff is Naguib Mahfouz, who, as I recall, was a Nobel Prize winning Egyptian author. His book, Arabian Nights and Days, is excellent. I guess it's not so much that I don't read fiction, it's that I don't keep it around. I've already got too many damn books. So, I go through a bunch of garbage fiction too, like sci-fi, fantasy, but when I'm done with it, I just give it away. And just to quickly wrap this up, this is another room. You can see here I've got a growing shelf on music from various parts of the world. That's a new section for me. I've got a lot more of my language books and language dictionaries in here. And then the rest is just, it's all over the place. There are a number of art books, particularly of Turkish artists, and then just a whole mess of books that have not yet been sorted into groups. A second shelf in this same room has quite a mix here. There are more of the Loeb Classic Library editions. That whole top shelf is some books that I borrowed from Tim that I need to get back to him. Then down from there, there's stuff on the Great Game, on the Boer War, on the Russian Revolution, the Baburnama, the East India Company, lots of stuff on geopolitics and strategy for China, Central Asia. Again, it's all over the place. Same with this other little shelf in here. I swear to God, I got fucking books everywhere, man. I used to think that they were super precious and I needed to save them and take care of them. But to be honest with you, I'm about to burn them in a wood stove. They're just fucking everywhere. And that's just upstairs. You head downstairs and you can see this shelf. And this isn't even half the books that my brother and I inherited from our father that we're still sorting through. So if you think about all of the books that you've seen thus far that are up on shelves, that's half or less than half of what I have in the house overall, because I have so many that I have in boxes that are mine or that I'm storing for friends. Fucking books, everywhere, books.
So that's it. You've seen my books. You've now gotten a glimpse into subjects that have interested me in the past. You've seen how I organize, the things that I have studied, and all of this organization on the shelves reflects to a certain degree the way in which I have things organized in my mind and memory, reflected in the mirror of my soul. So thanks for checking it out. Until next time, I'm Semiagog, and I'm